Welcome back. We are now reaching almost the end of this wonderful conference today. Our next panel, as you can see on the screen, is on art, music, and the humanities. And I will now ask Dr. Mason if she would please moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome to all. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing and moderating our panelists for the second panel today. And as I did with our morning panel, I will introduce each speaker one at a time when it is time for them to present. So first we have Ms. Angélica Dass, the creator of the Humanæ Project. Angélica Dass is an award-winning photographer born in Brazil and currently living in Madrid, Spain. Angélica's practice combines photography with sociological research and public participation in defense of human rights globally. She is the creator of the internationally acclaimed Humanæ Project, a collection of portraits that reveal the diverse beauty of human colors. The initiative has traveled to more than 80 cities across 6 continents, from the World Economic Forum in Davos to the pages of National Geographic, to promote dialogue that challenges how we think about skin color and ethnic identity. Without further ado, I pass the mic to Ms. Angélica Dass.
Hello, I think you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I will share screen with you. Yes, perfect. Well, I'm Angélica Dass, a Brazilian photographer based in Spain, and I'm here to talk about Humanæ. It's a very personal work that started because I was born in a very colorful family in Brazil. I always describe my family the same way. I was born in a family full of color. My father is the son of a maid from whom he inherited an intense dark chocolate tone. He was adopted by those who I know as my grandparents. My grandma, she has a porcelain skin and a cotton-like hair. My grandpa was somewhere between vanilla and strawberry yogurt tone, like my uncle and my cousin. My mother, a cinnamon skin, she's daughter of a native Brazilian with a pinch of hazelnut and honey. And a man, a mix of coffee with milk, but with a lot of coffee. My mother has 2 sisters, one in a toasted peanut skinny, the other also adopted, more on the beige side, as a pancake. So growing up in this family, color was never important for me. And outside home, things were different very soon. As I told, I was born in Brazil, the last country in the American continent to abolish the trade of human beings from the African continent. But to create this world, even if I started to take pictures when I was more than 30 years old, I started to thinking when I was really young, I never understood why, because if I human beings associated with 4 colors, associated with the concept of race, red, yellow, black, and white, this is the way that I learned when I was 6 years old. And I also remember clearly the day that the teacher introduced me pink crayon and she colored skin tone. So I was made of flesh, but I was not pink. My skin was brown, and people said I was black. No, I was expecting. I have 6, 7 years old with really mess of colors in my hair. So how I can explain, my world with my practice. So maybe let me show you. What I do in Humanæ is taking a picture of a white background, choose a square of 11 pixels from the nose, paint this background, and searching for the corresponding color in an industrial palette that is colored Pantone. And for people that don't know what is this palette, When we are talking about blue, which blue we are talking about? The blue of the sky, the blue of the sea, the blue of a butterfly. This is just a code of color. And I have to tell you, spoiler alert, I was not able to find, of course, any human beings that fits in the black and the, or white. No, the question is why we still define human beings like that. So when you look at my photos, you can see that my Christmas dinner is exactly how my work looks like. And now just to show you two of the persons that are extremely important in this work. It's my father and it's my grandmother. So people understand why all the colors in my work can be part of my Christmas dinner. This is the work that starts in this place, in this space like the museums and gallery. And the image on the right is exactly the Museo Leonardo da Vinci in Milan. That's a science and technology museum, the most important of the city. And in the entrance of the genetic department, what you find is exactly these images. And this connection with science is extremely important for me because it's not my story, my personal story, the story of my family, no? It's really about us. And this is a temporary exhibition that was in the American Museum of Natural History, but if you go exactly now in the room dedicated to the Homo sapiens, you will see Lucy, this Australopithecus that connect all of us, and in the end you will see a wall full of images of Humanæ. The most important thing in this exhibition was exactly the way that we try to explain, no? The color of you. This was the pillar of exhibition that was about color, the nature of color, no? So the color of you, eye, hair, skin. Women are wonderfully colorful, but skin color has been misused to separate people into races, and attitude toward the race have long been used to justify discrimination, segregation, and genocide. In fact, people are 99.9 genetically identical. We all share the same ancient ancestors. We are all one species. So is that for me, it's extremely important, this connection with science, because it's clear, no, it's not about me, it's really about us. This project was exhibited in public space all over the globe, and I have to highlight the importance of that. So you have these students just search for themselves, talking about their own identity, just because they cross with a piece of art in the middle of the street. And in the right, what you see, someone that's just cleaning the public space, and sometimes are the ones that don't feel that they belong to this world of art. So I think that is extremely important, bring everybody to this conversation. So one way is exactly put the art in the public space to really be able to bring everybody to the conversation. And this is installation in the World Economic Forum in Davos. No, that it's important to be in public space, but it's extremely important to talk with our leaders and really try to explain or to highlight who they are serving. So in this case, it was the first time in the story that you have art piece, that you have portraits that were showing the humanity that in theory these leaders were serving. And this also happened in this case that was Habitat 3, that was the meeting of United Nations to really talk about the future of the cities. And we have to keep in mind that we still live in a world that we have lines that divide the cities, and people with more melanin or less melanin, they are in one side and another. No, we still creating public spaces like that. And this was a meeting exactly to talk about the public space. And people always ask how the photo should function, and I really want to share this example. This is Chiasso in Switzerland. It's a place that people are crossing from Switzerland to Italy all the time, every day. And in this case, we have 3 days that we rent a store in the main street, and people were welcome to be portrayed. But I have to tell you that we invite the people that are just first level of the Italian classes in the municipality. They are refugees, migrants that recent arrive in the city, or even some kind of tourists that were temporarily there. We talk about our own identity, places that we came, we practice our very bad Italian, and then once volunteered to be portrayed. I also invite people for the residence of elders to have a tea, and exactly the same thing happens. So they talk about the new things that happen in the city and who wants can be portrayed by through the project. And I also did workshop with students. You see further, and the students, they can choose if they want to be part of the photo shoot or not. So what we had was the Piazza del Colori. There is a space that all these people in this city that sometimes don't even speak one with the other were really helping each other to find their own portrait and celebrate their own identity. A little bit in numbers, I have 4,576 portraits that I take in 20 countries and 37 cities all over the globe, from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to Daegu in South Korea, all the North, Canada, United States, Mexico, South, Brazil, Argentina, and in Europe, I don't know, France, Netherlands, in Asia, China, Korea, India. But of course, I was never able to find any human being that fits in the black and white. And maybe the most important information that you will find is exactly the lack of information. You don't know who's the poor, who's the rich, who's the migrant or not. So any information that you put in these portraits just belong to your own stereotypes. And I really wanted to show that you see these people one by one, they have exactly the same color, but of course, they are classified different based on the concept of race. It's clear that race is a social construction when you look at this image. So if it is a social construction, maybe we can deconstruct. In this case, the way to do that was jumping from the wall of the museum to the wall of the classroom. We're using the primary colors along with the black and white to be able to construct all skin tones. Red and green, we can create a brown. And from this brown, we are able to really create absolutely all skin tones. I love to start with this brown because we are celebrating the first family of Homo sapiens that decided to migrate for the African continent, and we don't know if they were searching for adventures or searching for a better life. What we do know is that we are here because of them. So, and starting with this brown and start with the same material, it's important to the students understand that as human beings, we come from the same material, even if each one of us is unique and different. So you can see how is the process that we are creating our colors out. Sometimes we pass through the same steps, how their piece of arts are much more interested than mine, than anything that I can do. That sometimes doing workshops in places that look that there is no diversity, what is the most important thing for these students that were in Czech Republic, that the only thing that was white was the paper that we are using. That the concept of white is also a social construction, and everything, every adjective that we attach what means white or what means black, it's really something that was constructed. Also, these 48 teenagers were the ones that lead workshops with more than 2,500 students between 6 and 12 years old. You know, we talk about the new generations as the one that will create the change, but how can we give them tools to really be able to provoke this change? You know, I'm almost in the end. I wanted to really show this, that are installations that were very similar to the ones that I do in outdoor spaces, This is in the Week of Arts, that is a big event of UNESCO. In this case, was in Chile. Was a collaboration with the government, and we have 75,000 students in the whole country, for little kids, for 3 years old till teenagers or even university students. They were all together creating their own self-portraits. And the most important things, they were the ones that were sharing with the community. They were the ones that are really exhibiting their work outdoor. I will never be able to portray the 8 billions of inhabitants that we have in the planet, but I really think that through art and through education, we can really deconstruct the concept of race. So, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Angélica.
I try, Maisel, to not exceed the 15 minutes, so
No, you did well.
almost there.
You did well. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Anika Prather. Anika Prather is an assistant professor at the Catholic University of America in the Department of Education. She has served in public and private schools for over 20 years as a teacher, school leader, and consultant. She is the founder of the Living Water School, a unique Christian school for independent learners based on the educational philosophies of classical education and the Sudbury model. She lives in Fort Washington, Maryland, with her husband, Damon, an engineer, and 3 beautiful kids. Dr. Anika Prather obtained her BA in elementary education from Howard University, followed by multiple graduate degrees in education from New York University and Howard University. She holds a master's in liberal arts from St. John's College and a PhD in English theater and literacy education from the University of Maryland, College Park. Her research centers on enhancing literacy among African American students through engagement with canonical literature. Recently, she self-published her book, Living in the Constellation of the Canon, The Lived Experiences of African American Students Reading Great Books Literature. As the co-author of The Black Intellectual Tradition with Dr. Angel Parham, Anika has taught in Howard University's Classics Department as a full-time lecturer. Additionally, she previously served as the director of high-quality curriculum and instruction at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy until February 2004. Dr. Prather is highly sought after as an educational consultant and speaker, particularly regarding the relevance of classical studies to the Black community. She is also the visionary behind the Living Water School, an accredited online Christian school grounded in classical education and the Sudbury model. Dr. Prather and her husband, Damon, reside in the DC area with their 3 children. Without further ado, I'm passing the mic on over to you, Dr. Prather.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today. I thought the most important thing for me to do first is to kind of give you some background on why I'm doing this work. Why is it so important to me to really look at the ways that we educate children so that they feel seen and heard. Now, as an African-American woman who was raised going to America's Christian schools, I experienced a lot of racism that took me on a journey. And from my experiences, I came to a place of just wanting to make sure no child goes through what I went through, especially in Christian educational spaces. I just want to just be honest and say that sadly, Christianity has been hijacked from a very racist perspective on faith and the Bible, all of that. And I know I can't change the world. I can't change everybody. But I think after reading Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and just really reading about his experience going to Christian schools, his book resonated with me, but it also gave me a stronger desire to show the world something different, to kind of either create a whole new way of looking at my faith and a whole new way of looking at Christian education, and a whole new way of looking at just educating children altogether. Part of my experiences in Christian schools involved just, thank you, Dr. Graves, a real silencing of my Blackness, a real silencing of, and when I say Blackness, I mean my culture, the music I love, the way I speak, the way I write, the way I dress, the way I wear my hair, everything about me, not necessarily my skin tone, but definitely that was, racism was definitely very prevalent, but just beyond my skin tone was silenced. I remember being taught in probably about 5th grade, and it was even before then, but I have a very clear memory sitting in a classroom in 5th grade and my Bible teacher, a white woman, saying that God made Black people inferior and that slavery and the white man set us free. And I remember going home and telling that to my mom and my dad. And at that point, my parents, even before then, my parents did a lot of teaching us about our history, but they began to teach my brother and I both how when we hear those things, even though we're in a predominantly white school, to not sit there in silence, but to correct the theology that was being taught. And so even though my parents kept us in that type of a setting until we graduated, I spent all of my years in elementary, middle, and high school correcting racist theology as a child and getting in trouble for it a lot. I remember wanting to start a gospel choir in my school and being told by the school leadership that gospel music is sinful. And so all of these experiences together took me beyond just fighting for my skin or my complexion to be accepted, but all of me to be accepted. And over the years, I've gone on this journey to figure out, how do I do that? What's the best place for me to really get at the root of this false theology of Christianity in America? How do I fix that? And so I chose education. I made a decision to go through K-12 education to begin to teach the next generation in public, private, charter, and Christian schools, that type of thinking, even though it seems it's only in the church, is pervasive in American culture. But if I could get children in my class to think differently about how we see human beings, then maybe, hopefully, one at a time, we could change the world. Now, some people may say, well, how, some people sometimes question my work because it does go into this classical world that is often dominated by white people. And we are often, all the time, left out of the story. It's almost like I feel like I'm creating a whole new way of looking at the ancient world, a whole new way of looking at ancient Greece and Rome, a whole new way of looking at classical learning. And why did I choose classical education? It started with my parents, even with my father being a professor at Howard University for about 40-something years. All of my whole family graduated from Howard University. My mom and dad decided to start a classical school in a predominantly Black neighborhood in PG County. And I had just graduated from Howard, and I was still very much frustrated by my K-12 experience. So when they decided to do that, I was very angry. And I said, how dare you bring this very European-centered curriculum into our community? We need to be learning about Toni Morrison and Malcolm X and the Black Panther and Olaudah Equiano, and just they don't need to learn more about European history. And my parents really let me see that they weren't doing this to erase our history, but they really wanted to show how it's all connected, that we're all part of the human family, that we all have this shared humanity that needs to be understood, that we have been functioning in this very Jim Crow-ish world where even we think we are separate, but in fact, we are all connected. This is why I love Mrs. Dass's work. I was just sitting here texting Sheena just how beautiful your work is, because it reveals that not very much really separates us. And so I found that the classical tradition allowed me to very clearly show our connectedness with receipts. as opposed to it being something theoretical or something I just think or an opinion. It became very data-driven through primary sources. And that was even a journey. And I hope you all are following me. I'm trying to get this all into 15 minutes. That was even a journey. So when my parents started the school, I eventually left public schooling to help them with the school. And then I ended up teaching one of their great books classes, but I would weave in African-American authors as well into that whole journey. And as I was sharing it, after I got married during that time, my husband, who's an engineer, and he's very data-driven. So I would tell him about how I was teaching this class and how much kids are loving Shakespeare and how much kids are loving Aristotle and how much they love Frederick Douglass and the great discussions we're having. And my husband is from Detroit. And he said, that all sounds all good and emotional, but you're still not telling me how this relates to us. And I need you to do a better job with that. And that is where the Black intellectual tradition was born. I had to prove to my husband that I knew what I was talking about and that this was really relevant. And in my journey of doing that, a lot of my purpose became defined, that the hurt and the anger and the frustration with the European American white community, or those who call themselves white people, the frustration I felt about that, I began to feel like I found answers. And why? Why is that? Because as I read, especially from the text of ancient Greece and Rome, I learned more about African empires and societies, because a lot of ancient texts reference ancient Egypt, ancient Ethiopia, or Kush, or Aksum, and some of those are interchangeable. They began to reference them, right? I learned about Memnon, okay? I learned about how Herodotus wrote whole books on the Ethiopian people and how great they were and how beautiful they were. I learned about how Ethiopia was called on to fight in the Trojan War because they couldn't beat them without that people group. And so, and that led me to stumble upon the work of Frank Snowden, who was, even though classics started when Howard started back in the 1800s, I think like 1867, Frank Snowden came along in the early 1900s and really solidified the classics department. And through his research in the classics world, he wrote several books, but the two main books he wrote were Blacks in Antiquity and Beyond Color Prejudice, I think it's called. And as I read both of those books and looked at his work, his desire wasn't to try to make everything Afrocentric. His desire was to show how we've been in conversation with one another. We have been building on the wisdom of one another, that no one is better, no one is greater, no one is less than. In the ancient world, there is no Jim Crow. And so take that understanding, and then I look at my experience in Christian schools where I was taught all wisdom started with the West, right? Where I was taught all greatness and philosophy and beauty and art and all of this and medicine and everything came from the West. When in fact, if you read the ancient text, Socrates even tells you, I learned this from the Egyptians. Euclid even tells you, I learned this part of geometry from the Egyptians. I'm kind of citing, you can look these things up and really, but most of these ancient writers in Greece and Rome acknowledged that their understanding of their knowledge came from African civilizations. Oh my goodness. The clincher for me, as I really began to delve into classical education and its relevancy to Black people, was when I was at Howard, and I was introduced. I love Howard University, if you don't know already, and I love Catholic U too, but Howard is my root for where I am today. And one of the things I learned at Howard University was about an African playwright named Terence, who was from Ethiopia. And he was brought into ancient Rome, enslaved, and not in the same captivity as we went through in America, but still was wrong. But his master taught him to read and write Latin. And as he learned that, he began to write these plays. And as a result of how famous his plays became, he became free. He functioned and lived amongst all of the royal people of Rome, and his plays were funded by those who fought against even Hannibal. And he wrote, they say, in the most perfect Latin. So take this, as I'm studying ancient Greece and Rome and the writings of various ancient authors, like for example, Plutarch has a beautiful book called Isis and Osiris. And even though we look at Plutarch, as this great ancient historian, he writes this book that really goes deep into Egyptian culture and heritage. And so I think about all of that, right? And I'm looking at Terence the African, who was just as famous as a playwright as Plautus. And his plays were very well respected. He became very wealthy. He died young. They're not sure if it was illness or a shipwreck, but he died young. But his plays lived on. In fact, his plays crossed the ocean into America. This ancient Ethiopian from Rome, who ended up living and becoming a playwright in Rome, his plays crossed the ocean into America because early American schools, even though they weren't for us as Black people, these early American schools taught Latin. And the textbook they used was Terence's plays. So one of the first American textbooks was were Latin plays written by Terence. And so John Adams wrote a letter, and you can look this up online, to his son, John Quincy Adams, and he tells him, if you want to know really good Latin, you must study the plays of Terence. So imagine what all of this journey, as I'm trying to prove my husband that I know what I'm talking about. Imagine how this reshaped what my childhood experience was. And all of this together gave me this burning desire to make sure every single child knows their history and how their history connects to other histories to make a human tapestry. We are one family. Socrates says, I am neither Greek or Athenian, but I am a citizen of the world. So all of my work is rooted in dismantling how children are educated in this real segregated way to a place where we all know that we are connected. And I'm going to end, if you don't mind, on this poem called Human Family by Maya Angelou. This is my mantra that I think about every time I do my work. And it says, I note the obvious differences in the human family. Some of us are serious, some thrive on comedy, some declare their lives are lived as true profundity, and others claim they really live the real reality. The variety of our skin tones can confuse, bemuse, delight, brown and pink and beige and purple, tan and blue and white. I've sailed upon the 7 seas and stopped in every land. I've seen the wonders of the world, not yet one common man. I know 10,000 women called Jane and Mary Jane, but I have not seen any two who really were the same. Mirror twins are different, although their features jibe, and lovers think quite different thoughts while lying side by side. We love and lose in China, we weep on England's moors, and laugh and moan in Guinea, and thrive on Spanish shores. We seek success in Finland, are born and die in Maine. In minor ways we differ, in major we're the same. I note the obvious differences between each sort and type, but we are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prather. That was beautiful. Thank you. I now have the distinct privilege of introducing Mr. Greg Thomas. Greg Thomas is CEO of the Jazz Leadership Project and co-director of the Omni American Future Project. Greg has written about culture, race, and democratic life in The Village Voice, Integral Life, New Republic, Salon, Uptown, The Guardian Observer, and the New York Daily News as jazz columnist. He has lectured on American cultural history and jazz at Columbia, jazz at Lincoln Center, his alma mater, Hamilton College, and Harvard. And I just want to pull up one more note about Greg's biography. Mr. Thomas is also the co-editor of the Omni American Review. In the fall of 2020, during the racial reckoning, he taught an online course called Cultural Intelligence, Transcending Race, Embracing Cosmos. A year later, with his partner Jewel Kinch Thomas and colleague Emil Handelsman, Greg co-taught a 6-month virtual course called Stepping Up, Wrestling with America's Past, Reimagining Its Future, Healing Together. In September 2022, he collaborated with yours truly, Dr. Sheena Mason and Dr. Carlos Hoyt Jr. on an in-person event titled Resolving the Race/Ism Dilemma. Greg has contributed to works centering on the work of blues philosopher and author of The Omni Americans, Albert Murray, including Albert Murray and the Aesthetic Imagination of a Nation and Murray Talks Music, Albert Murray on Jazz and Blues, for which he penned the afterword. His blog is Tune In to Leadership. Without further ado, Mr. Thomas, I pass the mic to you, my friend.
Dr. Mason, thank you so much. So I'll just launch right in. During their sojourn in the United States, multi-generation Afro-Americans have employed various stratagems and tactics to survive the centuries-long depredations of a racialized system of exploitation based on greed and power. Over the course of my life, I've tried on several facades, from born-again Christianity and liberal and conservative political ideologies to Black nationalism and Afrocentric spirituality. I've ultimately embraced a culturally centered omni-American identity. The omni-American idea, strongly grounded in appreciation for the homegrown design and innovation of blues and jazz as art forms and cultural technologies, derives from the thought and writings of Albert Murray, whose first book in 1970 was The Omni-Americans, Some Alternatives to the Folklore of White Supremacy. This homegrown philosophy afforded me a way to be proud of the heroic creativity of my ethnocultural kinfolk while confronting the cauldron of enslavement to Jim Crow segregation, in which blues, jazz, and other cultural forms were steeped and sculpted. As an Omni-American, I fully embrace my American identity and Afro-American heritage without shame or guilt, and my fellow Americans as well, even if I disagree with them politically. Poet Elizabeth Alexander begins the final section, coda, of her poem, Omni Albert Murray, by defining omni. Quote, omni, having unrestricted universal range. So omni-Americans are Americans, freed from the chains of thought and behavior that limit the vision and aspirations derived from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, our founding documents. Ralph Ellison aptly called these writings sacred. Omni-Americans then are universal Americans, striving to embody the best principles and values in our creeds and motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Embracing an omni-American identity has led me to disavow the very concept of race and the practice of racialization, which is how race, whether in guise as biological or social constructionist, becomes embedded as an identity that people accept as true. Although I and just about everyone else in the USA are ascribed a racial identity, I have exercised the individual liberty and agency to unsubscribe from that channel and platform of doom. Since the advent of modernity and the transatlantic slave trade, those profiting from the selling and buying of human chattel rationalized their actions in tribal and ethnocentric terms, and as well with pseudoscientific and religious justifications, as we've already heard today, so that all those victimized by the immoral enterprise would be considered less than human and worthy of lower caste status. These justifications became a worldview hinged on stereotypes about people that turned them into unchanging essences, essentialism. Yet so-called Black people weren't the only persons wounded by this vicious worldview. For so-called white people, the benefits of racialized whiteness often came at the cost of suppressing or erasing their ethnic heritage and pre-American history and adopting a twisted psychology that assumes superiority or supremacy based on skin color privilege. Robin DiAngelo, in the concluding chapter of her bestseller, White Fragility, cautioned European ethnics against identifying with their cultural heritage before assimilation into whiteness. Quote, "White identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. That does not mean that we should stop identifying as white and start claiming only to be Italian or Irish. To do so is to deny the reality of racism in the here and now. And this denial would simply be colorblind racism. Rather," she writes, "I strive to be less white." So DiAngelo's approach to anti-racism not only refuses to challenge the very concept of race itself, but she denies the value of reclaiming an ancestral heritage before the process of racialization created races categorized as white and Black in the first place. She says that racialized whites should accept racial categorization, and being white automatically means they're racist. A fait accompli, to be sure. Now, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1970s, so expressions like oy vey are part of my vocabulary. Perhaps it's too much to ask someone who has amassed quite a lucrative career in anti-racism consulting and publishing to confront the very concept, process, and worldview that results in racism. But fortunately, there are writers and thinkers, such as those we've heard today, who provide much better diagnoses of the problem of racism and prescriptions to resolve it. Distinguishing the concept of race, the practice of racialization, and a racial worldview from the meaning and practice of culture is a crucial step to deracialization via an omni-American vision. Along with the aforementioned Albert Murray, my argument is bolstered by the vision and oeuvre of his longtime friend Ralph Ellison, author of the 20th century literary classic Invisible Man. So I'll share a few quotes that should suffice to demonstrate this distinction. In a letter to Murray in 1958, Ellison wrote about an exchange he had on a panel at the Newport Jazz Festival with a composer critic who, when Ellison mentioned the tie between the Negro American dance audience and jazz bands, interrupted Ellison to say that, quote, he didn't believe that jazz was connected to the life of any racial group in this country, end quote. The conflation of race and culture reared its ugly head. Ellison wrote to Murray, quote, "I don't fight the race problem in matters of culture, but anyone should know the source of their tradition before they start shooting off their mouth about where jazz comes from," end quote. Culturally speaking, jazz was birthed in the bosom of Afro-American life and culture. That's not a racial claim. It's an ethnocultural fact and historical fact. Now, also in 1958, Ellison said in an interview that, quote, as for the term culture, I know of no valid demonstration that culture is transmitted through the genes, nor should the existence of a specifically Negro idiom in any way be confused with the vague racist terms white culture or black culture. Rather, it is a matter of diversity within unity, end quote. Diversity within unity is, of course, a riff on e pluribus unum. Now, we'll explore the significance of the word idiom in what I call the Ellison-Murray continuum in more detail shortly. But for now, let's go a bit deeper via another Ellison quote, and this one from 1970. Quote, without the presence of Negro American style, our jokes, tall tales, and even our sports would be lacking in the sudden turns, shocks, and swift changes of pace, all jazz-shaped, that serve to remind us that the world is ever unexplored, and that while the complete mastery of life is mere illusion, the real secret of the game is to make life swing. End of quote. In a 1970 address at Brown University titled Portrait of Inman Page, a dedication speech, Ellison spoke of Page, one of the first Afro-American graduates of Brown during the Reconstruction period, and of his experience as a young man at Douglas High School in Oklahoma when Dr. Page was its principal. Ellison recalled the early New England tradition of education of which both he and Dr. Page were heirs because, as he wrote, the young graduates of New England colleges who went south, to teach newly freed slaves. Ellison continued, I think it is a good idea to keep this historical circumstance in mind when we hear glib talk of a white culture and a black culture in the United States. Because the truth of the matter is that between the two racial groups, there has always been a constant exchange of cultural and stylistic elements, whether in the arts, education, athletics, or in certain conceptions and misconceptions of democratic justice. Interchange, appropriation, and integration, not segregation, have been the constants of our developing nation. Again, he's speaking in cultural terms, not just political, economic, and social. So back to his quote. So at this particular moment of our history, Ellison reasoned, I think it important that we keep in mind that the culture of the United States is a composite, pluralistic culture of cultures, and that all of its diverse elements have been to some extent inspirited by those ideals which were enshrined during the founding of this nation. In our embrace of these ideals, we are one yet many, and never more so than after they led to the Civil War, the Emancipation, and the Reconstruction, end quote. For our final Ellison statement to bolster our case of culture versus race, I'll quote from a 1977 interview in which three younger Afro-American male writers, Ishmael Reed, Quincy Troup, and Steve Cannon, queried an elder master. Along the way, Ellison said, quote, the pervasive operation of the principle of race or racism in American society leads many non-blacks to confuse culture with race, which prevents them from recognizing to what extent American culture is Afro-American. This can be denied, but it can't be undone because the culture has had our input since before nationhood. It's up to us to contribute to the broader recognition of this pluralistic fact. While others worry about racial superiority, let us be concerned with the quality of culture, end quote. Now, I'll update Ellison's statement from nearly 50 years ago by saying that it ain't just so-called non-blacks that confuse race and culture today. So that's the Ellison side of the culture versus race debate. Now let's consider Albert Murray's perspective on our predicament, and I'll need a few more minutes, Sheena. Okay. In the first chapter of the Omni Americans, Murray wrote that he considered race a sterile category that is hardly as useful as an index to human motives as is culture. And in the introduction to that same classic work, he also wrote that, quote, The function of education in the U.S. is to develop citizens who are fully oriented to cultural diversity and are not hung up on race, end quote. In 1994, a writer named Lewis Edwards interviewed Murray, beginning with a discussion of the Omni-Americans. Murray explained that his first book was stimulated by the civil rights movement and the identity, quote, of who these people were and how they saw themselves. So, Murray continued, I wanted to define what it meant to be an American and how we fit into it. I came up with the idea that we're fundamental to it, that you can't be an American unless you're part us, just as you can't be an American unless you're part them. I came up with the concept of a culture that, as a context, makes for literally and figuratively speaking a mulatto culture. America is interwoven with these different strains. The subtitle of that section of the book is E pluribus unum, one out of many. They represent what American cultural philosopher Constance Rourke calls a composite. Now, Edwards, the interviewer, then says, then the term Omni-Americans applies not just to African Americans, but to all Americans? To which Murray responded, yes, absolutely. We're looking for universality. We're looking for the common ground of man. If you go from culture instead of the impossibility of race, because you can't define race, it doesn't meet our intellectual standard with scientific observation and definition. It won't meet it. You see, race is an ideological concept. It has to do with manipulating people and with power and with controlling people. It has no basis in reality. So what you enter into to make sense of things are patterns and variations in culture. What you find are variations we can call idiomatic. People do the same things, have the same basic human impulses, but they come out differently. The language changes because of the environment and so forth. Now you can get the environment, you can get the cultural elements, and from those things you can predict the behavior, of people fairly well. But if you look at such racial characteristics as may be used, the shape of certain body parts, the texture of the hair, the lips and all, you cannot get a scientific correlation between how the guy looks and how he behaves. If you find a large number of people who look like each other and behave like each other, it's because of the culture. And I will fast forward to my closing paragraph because I have more to say. By embodying an omni-American vision and identity, and by striving to perpetuate its insights and value to current and future generations through the organization I co-direct, the Omni-American Future Project, I hope and intend that we as a nation can indeed realize our promise and thrive by freeing ourselves from the shackles of a worldview based on race, racialization, and racism, and integrating ourselves and integrating into ourselves the generative qualities of American culture at its best.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you.
I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Carlos Hoyt. Carlos is a licensed independent clinical social worker and a PhD in social work. He provides psychotherapy to children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families, and consultation and training on matters related to social identity, social bias, and social justice to individuals and organizations seeking to realize their inclusivity aspirations. Through his research, writing, teaching, training, and speaking, Carlos invites clients and audiences to scrutinize master narratives of identity, including the dominant discourse on race, with the goal of illuminating and virtuously disrupting the racial worldview and reductive identity constructs in general. Carlos's first book, The Arc of a Bad Idea, Understanding and Transcending Race, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He has written peer-reviewed articles on racism and spirituality and contributed an essay on empathy in a compendium of writings on peace psychology. Dr. Hoyt appears on several podcasts and informational videos, providing insights and guidance on topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racialization, including a TEDx talk, Charting a Course Beyond Racism. And his ideas about race in the US Census were recently featured in the Washington Post and Celeste Headley's Hear Me Out. Carlos's most recent book, Diversity Without Divisiveness, A Guide to DEI Practice for K-12 Education, is currently available from Routledge Publishing and became available in December 2024. Without further ado, I pass the mic on to you, Dr. Carlos Hoyt.
Thank you, Sheena. Let me share some slides. Let's see. Let's go to full screen. All right, I'll actually put myself on a timer to see how I do here with this 15-minute allotment. I do want to say I'm so busy that it didn't occur to me to tell the planners, please don't make me go last and have to follow all these brilliant and lovely people. But here I am. It has been a real inspiration to listen to everything that's happened today. So thank you all for the work you've put into this, from the conceptual to the technical to just the wonderful content that every single speaker has provided. Thank you quite sincerely for that. I'm going to jump right in because time is short. I'm going to walk you through some slides that hopefully will help me be efficient and try to convey everything I have in mind. And these slides can be made available to you too afterwards if anything on them might be helpful. I'm always happy to say to people, if I share something that you can adopt or adapt and it will help you do your thing, then please go ahead and do it. So in terms of title, obviously the conference title is there. And then you see in yellow, Back to the Rough Ground, which is a somewhat, if you're a philosopher, I guess a modern philosopher person, famous phrase from Wittgenstein. It shows up in his Philosophical Investigations book. And I hope that as I go through the slides, you'll get a sense of why I'm using it as sort of my subtitle for the conference. Before we go any further, I do want to take a moment to make a public service announcement regarding the current discourse on DEI. And I do hope this will tie in, or you'll see that this ties into what I'm after later on as well. If a professional setting policies to support workplace diversity is engaged in DEI, as I think everybody would say, yep, that's what DEI is, then so too is a policymaker setting rules that limit diversity efforts. It's all DEI. We are not witnessing a struggle between pro and anti-DEI factions, as everybody seems to frame it, including the journalists, which is frustrating me. We're not witnessing that because there's no such thing as being anti-DEI. That's the case because diversity, equity, and inclusion processes and decisions are inextricably part of every human interaction. What counts as an acceptable range of human differences, whether it's folks coming to your party or who you think should be a citizen of the United States? Who gets to be treated as if they are more equal than others, which is an equity issue? And who gets a seat and a say, which is inclusion? That's what DEI is about. How we answer those questions, though, is different than saying that DEI is this or that. DEI is about these things that are always part of human interaction. What we're suffering through right now is the age-old contest between what I call DEI expansivism. You know, let's include the widest range of people, treat them all well, give them all a voice, do the best we can. And we've seen that happen in American history. Or what we might call that DEI FA, right? DEI for all. And then the other side of that is DEI restrictivism, or what we might call DEI just for us, or DEI FU. What's gushing out of Washington right now is not anti-DEI, right? And I hope going forward, you'll appreciate that. When people talk about it that way, I hope you realize that's impossible. That's not what's happening. What it is a whole lot of DEI FU if you're not part of the privilege set. The book that Sheena mentioned that just came out, I got to write it, you know, as all this stuff was roiling. Obviously, we hadn't gone through the election yet, but we were moving up on it. So I spent a lot of time trying to correct, some misconceptions, some deliberate misconceptions about what DEI is and DEI isn't. And I'm just happy to have had the opportunity from Rutledge and to have worked with my partner, Minahem, you see her name here, to try to provide some conceptual clarity, but also a whole lot of practical tools for the folks who are near and dear to my heart on this planet, and that is teachers of K-12 kids. I know we all agree that what's happening right now regarding K-12 and education in general is a travesty, and I hope that what's in this book might be useful for our friends who are trying to hold down the fort and take care of kids and teach them properly. I talk about race, racism, and racialization in the book. I talk about ways to help folks understand racialization, lesson plans on it, fun ways to actually engage with it, so that we can start to foster and I think support, children's natural philosophical inclination to see past some constructions that later adults sort of foist on them. So that's in the book as well. In terms of what we're talking about today, racialization, race, and racism are about a lethally false notion of human diversity that has been and continues to be lethally divisive. If we're ever to achieve diversity without divisiveness, as I talk about in the book, we must correct our bearing, our psychology on this, and change our behavior. And the piece I'm talking about today actually has to do with behavior. I noticed that this section of the program is titled Art, Music, and Humanities, all of which are also near and dear to me. But this is actually policy that I'm going to talk about for a little bit today. Abolishing racism, and necessarily race, requires the end of reification, of false differences, which is what racialization is. When I spell out racialization, I talk about the 5-step sort of process of selecting some way of dissecting people from one another, sorting people according to that whatever you selected, could be hair color, skin color, etc., attributing all sorts of qualities to them that can't be seen on the surface, essentializing those qualities and saying it's hereditary and biological, and then acting on it as if it's okay to treat people differently based on those superficial differences. Ending reification, essentialism, and racialization requires 2 things I'm going to propose. One is a clear and compelling orientation to and education about the issue, right? People need to understand what it is we're talking about. And the second is mobilizing people, lots of them, plus folks in key positions, in pursuit of a crucial common goal, and that is changing the way race is treated in the US Census. And obviously, I'll try to say more about why that's so crucial. So again, just to repeat, ending reification, essentialism, and racialization requires 2 things. One is the clear and compelling orientation and the education that I mentioned. The other is the mobilization. So where are we with those 2 things? I would argue that regarding the first one, we're doing just fine, right? Just in my own work, which is what I just put up here right now. I've gotten to write a book about it. I'm not the greatest writer in the world. There's no perfect book, but there it is. It's out there. I got to do a TEDx talk about it. And if you go to my website, you'll actually see a collection of writings, videos, all sorts of things that I'm calling the non-racial worldview library. If you can take a close look here, you can actually see Dr. Gray's or one of Dr. Gray's books in my pile. My point is that there's a lot of wonderful orientation to and education about this issue. We just actually had a whole day of it just now, right? Brilliant insights, arguments, constructions, understandings about why, race is a problem that should be solved. What we're not doing so well, in my view, is the mobilizing people piece. Mobilizing lots of them, right, to change the way race is treated in the US Census. This is a different kind of work than many, most, possibly all of us, I don't know how many people, I don't know all the people who are in the audience, do on a regular basis. We are, many of us, institutional academics. There are some of us who stepped out of academia. I'm one of those people. But most of us, lots of us, are thinkers and presenters and people who are trying to help the world see and understand what the problems are with race, racialization, essentialism. I'm going to suggest that what needs to happen in addition to all of that, I'm not saying that that's over and everything is solved. As was said earlier, there's still a lot of people who think that race is biological. So that work needs to continue, and it's work that I enjoy doing. I think at the same time, though, we need to do the actual work that got us into this trouble. We need to rework that work. And that work is the work of the US Census. From the US Constitution, 1787, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, the new country, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, and you know who those are, including those bound to service for a term of years, indentured servants, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. And we know who those are too. Right? That's how it all began officially, right? Now, obviously, that was based on practices that were already happening. This was just a codification of the racism that was in place. And that's how it played out the first time around, right? Here's the schedule of the whole number of persons within the division allotted to. NAB is just a placeholder for the marshal that came to your door, sized you up, and marked you down in one of these categories. We need to focus on changing this. I took a shot at this. I think it was over the past 2 years, right? This is actually from a change.org petition. And as you can see, I've gathered 701 signatures over that time. That's not 7 million. It's not 70,000. It's not 7,000. It's 701. It's an awful number in terms of change.org. Now, the thing that I'm promoting, obviously, I think it's a good idea. But what I'm here to tell you is I'm not good at this stuff. I'm not a community organizer. I don't have the nature, the disposition to sort of go and beat the bushes and do the kind of stuff that people can do. And part of why I'm presenting the way I am today is to wonder if there are people in this very audience, or if people might know somebody or some people who are down to do this kind of work, because I think that's what's necessary. Before I move off of the slide, I'll just say that these two pieces that you see down here, they are, oops, let me take that down. They are linked in the slideshow, so you can see the long write-up on this whole case for why we should do this stuff. And then a presentation that I actually got to make to some folks at the census. The basic two issues here are, we're not giving people a chance to say if they do not identify by race, right? That to me is a constitutional issue. You know, it actually breaches, goes against my freedom from compelled speech. And the other is, we're not really looking at what we should be tracking in terms of discrimination and oppression. And somebody brought this up earlier. I propose that the solution to that is to ask people not just how they self-racialize, if they do at all, but how others racialize them, because that's what determines how you're treated. Again, this is a different kind of work than most of us do. Here's some work that was done in several US Census categories over the time that the census has been happening. And these are all decennial census categories. So this is a list of key moments when communities successfully lobbied for greater recognition. It happened with the American Indians, Mexicans, Asians, some other race. And again, these are the official terms, so please don't worry about how I'm using them personally. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, Black African American, mixed race, and most recently, MENA, Mixed Eastern and North African. All of these things came about in great part due to community mobilization and citizens actually saying, we want to be seen, we want to be counted. And you probably see where I'm going with this. And just to sort of zoom in on the Black African American, 1970 to 2010, how did it happen, right? There was advocacy. The term Negro was widely used in the census until 2010. That's not very long ago. But Black racialized civil rights leaders and scholars had long advocated for change. In 1970, the census added Black as an option alongside Negro. They didn't even get rid of Negro, who was still there. By 2010, advocacy efforts led to the removal of Negro altogether, with the category simply listed as Black or African American. I'm zooming in on this one because obviously it's sort of at the center of what we're talking about today, but also to say, or to show us how long it took, right? This is a long game that we're talking about here, and it has to be done incrementally as far as I'm concerned. I know lots of people, and I think I am one actually in my heart, who just would like to topple over the whole thing and just stop it. But the census doesn't work that way. I was fortunate when I was doing my PhD research to be able to talk to the former director of the US Census Bureau, a guy named Randy Pruitt. And he wrote this beautiful book. This book's called What is Your Race? And Kenneth Pruitt, Kenneth was not shy, or is not shy about saying what's wrong with the census. The census is about lots of things, but it's also primarily about making the census work. So many of the changes we see in the census, if they're not driven by community efforts, are to make sure that people are ticking off boxes. Many of the changes are to answer the question, how can we get more people to tick off a box, right? We want to change that. Back to the rough ground for me is to suggest that we need to not just do the academic, theoretical research argument stuff, but also get down there. And I'll read a little bit here. We, and I mean all of us who are on this call today, we've diligently and accurately discerned that the rough ground of social identity, and in this case, particularly race, is toxic and fertile only in that it's a great habitat for the growth of lethal absurdity. We've written and taught and talked and argued flawlessly that this ground needs to be overturned, removed, and replaced with a healthful ecosystem of logic, evidence, and justice in which real and relevant understandings of human similarities and differences can thrive. Much of Dr. Gray's work is just about that. But we know that a good, accurate, right idea or argument does not always carry the day. Don't we? Don't we wake up to that reality every day recently? We know that to change the rough ground, we have to come down from our towers, grab our shovels, grab our friends, tell them to grab their shovels, and dig in. In my view, this is coalition work, and the coalition should include, first and foremost, people who are the subject of coerced speech and are invisible in the looking glass of human diversity. And by that, I mean all of us who just simply don't identify with this concept of race. Scientists for sure, lawyers we're going to need, community organizers, educators, students, artists, athletes, and politicians, I'm sorry to say these days, and the list is probably longer. As I was looking through the departments at UMichigan, there's humanities, there's a behavior and social sciences department, education, journalism, public policy, public health, and I just wonder, what are they teaching in all those areas? One of the things I think I am comfortable doing is talking to department heads like about what you're teaching and what we're not teaching. That to me could be, an effort within this larger effort to get the census to recognize that we need to make this change. So again, the change we want to make, the paltry numbers that Dr. Hoyt has certainly gotten so far. And then the question I'll end with, are there any among us who are ready to dig in? Again, not to say that the work we're doing in our thoughtful way isn't good, but to invite, the question, can we do more? Should we do more? How do we affect policy? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoyt. So now I invite all the panelists to come back on camera and join me for a bit of Q&A, which we have roughly 30 minutes for, so plenty of time. Dr. Prather, I know you have to leave a little early, so I'm going to direct the first question that's intended for you to you. Yes, Marseille writes, Dr. Prather, your backstory was validating. I attended what's still considered one of the top Christian college prep schools in my state, which is where I learned I was an inferior being per God. And consequently, that led to massive, massive, massive self-hatred as a new immigrant in America. Interestingly enough, my grade school and high school experience prepared me for my horrific experience as a graduate student at NYU years ago. All of the darker skinned women who were my friends at said college prep school have residual self-hatred to this day. We are in our 40s, and it's challenging for them to believe they are image bearers. That being said, I'm curious to know, if applicable, how was your visual or ideological image of God shifted, or how has your visual or ideological image of God shifted from childhood to adulthood? Thank you so much.
It didn't ever shift because my parents made me understand that Jesus was not white. It was something that was taught in the home, that Jesus was not any race, and I'm still on a journey, right? So now what did shift is me going from Jesus was a Black man to Jesus includes all of us, right? And it got me into really looking at, it's really been a lot of heavy reading of ancient literature, but looking at his genealogy. And you can see in his genealogy, he has just about every ethnicity in his genealogy. And then his story is, he's born in what would be now like Palestine, but then he moved to Egypt. He lived in Egypt for a while, for like the first 2 years of his life. Then he settles back in Israel. So he was extremely universal. So and then if you take that understanding and then connect it to, like, say, the day of Pentecost, when the early church first starts, it starts in a way where it doesn't, Christianity doesn't belong to an ethnicity or a people group or a race. He actually took it out of Israel's hand, or the Jewish hand, and on that day, Christianity was given to every continent in the world at the same exact time. That's a whole nother story and a whole nother conversation. I don't want to go too long. So that, I grew up with that understanding. That's what, my father's a preacher. That's what he preached from the pulpit. The difficult thing, though, is going into schools that didn't teach that and just constantly butting heads with a false doctrine was a struggle for me. So my only change was taking Jesus out of taking race, or how am I saying this backwards? Taking Jesus out of race, or taking race out of Jesus. Like, that has shifted for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Byron Haskins writes, story, song, and visual art often show the things we're committed to, even exposing our conflicting commitments. What kind of concrete behaviors by those in the arts help or obstruct progress toward raceless anti-racism? What social and cultural assumptions esteemed in the arts hold us back from art forms that create a more human-centered, non-racist versus anti-racist story to be told? And this is for anyone who feels so inspired to respond.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. I think one way is to, as I tried to present in my presentation, to distinguish race and culture. So one of the things about the work of Ellison and Murray is that they were pretty clear on the relationship between the particular and the universal. There was a little of that in my presentation. So if you write about or draw or sculpt or dance about a particular ethno-cultural community or configuration, if you do it well enough, the humanity and soul in what you do can connect to other people. Even though it's coming from a particular place, it touches other people in their soul, in their own cultural experience, and they can relate. And that's one of the way art can bridge us. When I read a story of literature, the main character doesn't have to be, my particular historical background for me to identify with the character, you know? So I think that's one way. Don't just limit yourself. So just another aspect. Don't just limit yourself to representing your particular, let's say your particular intersectional idea. I'll put it like that, you know, uh, and just confining yourself to feel that you have to represent that solely. If you do it well enough, it should touch people outside of those bounds.
The musical artist, Questlove, who's also a wonderful producer and just super knowledgeable about music, completed, it's out now, so obviously he finished it a long time ago, but this, in my estimation, just wonderful documentary on Sly and the Family Stone. And one of the things that Questlove highlights is that, Sly broke ground, around presenting not just like crazy, wonderful music, but diversity. There are men and women in the band, there are Black racialized and white racialized people in the band. And like he didn't have to make a big deal out of it, just that they were doing it, meant something. I'll go from that to something a bit more banal. I noticed, and I'm terrible with my own chronology, but I'm going to say 15, 20 years ago, commercials on TV started to change in this way that I found really interesting. Because if a family were going to be shown or a couple was going to be shown, They looked alike in terms of racialization. And as time has gone by since, like, I don't know if somebody made a decision or it's just a real sort of cultural moment and things have shifted, you'll now see dark-skinned people like partnered with light-skinned people, right? It's not part of the story or anything, they're just there. And I do believe, especially as I watched my kids watch TV when I was coming up, that those things do soak in. So from a higher art end, which is what I consider Sly's music, to just television commercials, I think there is incremental gain. Not to say that we're where we need to go, but things are moving, I think.
I just want to say, Carlos, I think that with the commercials, you're right. It does represent true diversity, but I think there's a straight up marketing reason for that. So if you show, two different ethnicities in one commercial, you got two demographic groups that you can touch. I mean, that's, it really comes down to that. But I think in terms of how we see it, in terms of representation and how it impacts people, it can be positive. But I think there's a real commercial basis for that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. But that's always been true,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
what's happening without any diverse
That's right.
representation, it's not going to stop happening, but at least now there's some diverse representation.
Right. I'm not skeptical about it. I think it's a good move. Yeah.
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 And can I just add too, I think because my heart is always thinking about children, they're so impressionable, especially at young ages. As an educator, as a parent, we have to be very intentional about showing the different types of people in conversation, in connection with one another. We all tend to be affected by Jim Crow in that, Black people think I'm only going to read Black literature to my kids, only let them see Black pictures, Black movies, Black TV shows, and of course, white people do the same. But what I'm trying to do is grow into showing all of us constantly interconnecting. That's one of the things I've discovered as I've gone through this classical tradition, is this constant back and forth, this constant engagement, this constant going across continents, and just trying to raise up a generation that practices that. And trying to show that through the arts, through music, and so on.
Well, I'm more like kind of shy to jump in because I think that maybe I'm the one that is not US based. I don't saw the whole day, but when we are thinking about, I'm sorry, let's just organize the ideas. I was really thinking about the universality of the work that I'm doing. That I have these kind of conversations about identity and race literally in the entire planet. And the narrative is exactly the same. So we construct a humanity, a society, a planet that we attach a lot of sad and bad adjectives to what means the dark tones, and good adjective what means the light tones. And listen and understanding that what I exactly do with the kids is exactly how we can really provoke a new conversation and attach a new adjectives for this conversation, and to this narrative that will how we can unlearn all the things that were deeply inside of us. And I'm really you're talking about US, but I'm really thinking about Brazil. So that we have such amount of connections. But I'm also thinking about Spain, that the place that I'm living, and there are a lot of Afro-Spanish that don't have maybe the history and the background that you have in US. I just want to jump and say that we are talking about human beings and it's universal. Sadly, but also happy too, because we can really change this from this togetherness. And I think that for this way of think that it's about us, definitely. And we will not solve if it's not something that's collective.
Wonderful, thank you. And Angélica, since you are on the mic, I have a question for you from Yaz Marseille. I am a storytelling photographer who learned about your innovative visual work years ago, and it touched me, as I grew up in a country where I was not seen as a race, but rather a skin tone. Also, from a phenotypic perspective, my immediate and extended family mirrors yours. So this was another reason I was attracted to the personal dimension of Humanæ. Now, in my homeland, hue and hair texture are considered extremely important in determining how much respect you'll receive. I'm curious to know how hair textures have played a role within one or more of your geographical contexts. Thank you so much.
I think that the first thing that we even talked about a very personal story, because I have a straight hair, kind of super straight as Beyonce until I was 27 years old. And I had to move to Spain, and suddenly I've been here, and I of course don't have all the hairdressers and all the things that I used to have in Brazil. And suddenly I said, what have you do now? I just cut my hair, and then I discovered that it is like it is, and I love this. But every time I go back home, especially in the beginning, 20 years ago, I have always my mother asking me about what happened with you? You are without money. Do you want to go to the hairdressers and go with me? And I have to tell that I have this conversation in different parts of the planet. For example, when I was in Santo Domingo, the narrative was exactly the same. How can I do to whiteness what my identity is? Because it's exactly this that we also do with the hair. So I start as personal, but I have to tell that there are different parts in this planet that this is global. And of course, hair is part of also what fits you, not just in the concept of race, but what is valuable or not. So when I'm talking about adjectives associated with the concept of race, well, when I was in India, I was not specifically talking about race, but the conversations about I can't be outside when I was young. My mother don't allow me to play out because I will be darker was also part of the conversation that I have in my studio. And it's not about directly the race as we are thinking about in US or Brazil. It's not that, but it is exactly the same, even if the name is not this when you're talking about yourself in that case, you know. So those were the kind of experiences that I have. Everything that you in your body makes you fit in this concept that will dehumanize you. You will, and I listen this, try to follow or to get out of this pattern. So that's why it happens all over the globe. And this is a conversation that is very important, the texture of the hair.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas, this question is directed to you. Omni Americans by Murray was key to my personal, cultural, and intellectual development, and to some of my closest friends. It presented something jazz-like and altogether more beautiful than even an essentialist Black mythic pride. It endorsed a kind of glorious mongralism, a truthful intellectual promiscuity. Ooh, I like that. If I was willing to put something down, I could pick up something so much better. Do you believe the brilliant ontological accomplishment of jazz has the power to subdue race? And this is from Malik Wilson.
All right. That's wonderful to hear. And the answer is yes. Ontology has to do with, being and the nature of reality and existence. And I'll give an anecdote that, and 'cause I could give like a 1, 2, 3, 4 answer, but I think an anecdote will kind of express it. So there was a gentleman named Charles Black, and in the 20s, he was a young man, lived in Texas, and he's Caucasian. And so he's racialized as white in the South, or white racialized. And he went to a concert, I think it was 16. He went with another friend, and he went there to meet girls. It happened to be a performance by Louis Armstrong. And he says that he went there to meet girls, but then what he witnessed and experienced was genius. He was awestruck at the power and beauty and genius of Louis Armstrong's playing. And it created cognitive dissonance for him. Why? Because he said, these people are supposed to be less than. But I know that what I am seeing and hearing and feeling is genius. How do I reconcile that? His friend probably went through the same thing, but he left out. He said, oh, he's nothing but an N-word. Whereas Charles Black was inspired in his work to move forward to addressing that cognitive dissonance. He became a lawyer, a constitutional scholar, and law professor, and he helped to write the briefs for the Brown versus Board of Education case. And that seminal experience with Louis Armstrong and jazz had an impact politically, socially with that case. So I connect those to say, yes, jazz can have that impact for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. And Dr. Hoyt, this question is for you from Yaz Marseille. We spoke about almost 10 years ago, so you may not remember me. FYI, a couple years back, I signed your petition to improve the 2030 census. Before my question, I must offer a disclaimer. I have never been and will never be a fan of the current POTUS. Now, during the president's inaugural speech, he noted, I will also end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. We will forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based, end quote. In light of your work to revise how the US Census collects identification data, do you believe the president's aforementioned statement might make it slightly easier to push for the revamping of the identification section of the US Census? Or do you think their rhetoric might one day lead to the removal of the identification section altogether? If the latter were to hypothetically happen, would you still push for the collection of phenotypic data? Thank you so much.
That's a great and thoughtful question, yeah, so thank you. Regarding the current administration, I'll go back to the first time that Trump was in office. I was working at an independent school, elementary through 8th grade, and I was the DEI director. And I ended up writing this sort of community reminders about the time we were in, because it was such a time of unrest. And there are 3 things that I highlighted for our students and everybody else. One is we're not going to blame, COVID, on people of a certain ethnicity, which was going around. The other is we're not going to come in and say all cops are bad, because that's just illogical and it doesn't make any sense. And, if any politician, including, the one who's running for president called Trump, misbehaves, it's okay to talk about that. That's what we do here, right? We don't shy away from that. And the board of that school, gave me some pretty clear messages that you mustn't do that. Our IRS status sort of depends on not appearing to promote, or, work against a candidate. And I didn't get fired, thankfully, but it was quite a moment. And I say all that because this is not a partisan thing for me, but as I observe, our president and what's coming out of Washington, I can't trust it. Because it changes from one day to the next. I don't know what's really sincere, so President Trump's statements that you so well quoted, going back to the slide I had about we need to clarify our bearing on this thing, get some good education. There's no reason for me to believe that he is clear on what's going on with race, and that he's taken time to learn it. He doesn't seem to be that kind of a guy. That might sound harsh, but I'm just making an observation. So I sort of conceptually separate, my push for what should be done with the US Census and race from whether or not this presidency might support something like that. Because I really think it comes down to this administration is supporting things that give it more resources, power, whatever it is, and pushing against things that don't. So we're in an interesting moment where one could imagine, folks pushing for this and it actually being embraced by folks who just want race to be out of the way so that there's no accountability anymore, which is why I think it's so important that there be a way to continue to track misbehavior, mistreatment based on someone's perception of who you are. And for me, that goes beyond this thing that we call race. It happens with gender and all the social identity groups. And I think if this country ever wants to get serious, about protecting people from social bias based on social identity, it'll start to track that stuff. not just how I see myself, but how other people see me and how I think they treat me based on that. And we don't do that right now.
Thank you. This question is for anyone who feels so inspired to respond. And this is from Kate Tinnen. How do we talk about the problem of what we call white supremacy without reinforcing the reductive and essentializing concept of white, which my interpretation of this question is pointing to the fact that the term white supremacy potentially reinforces the category of white, right? So what suggestions do you have for Kate?
I'll respond, but I want to wait since I just spoke and make some space for other people.
I'll speak up. One part of my presentation, I so mistimed it. I had done a bunch of cuts and it still was too long, you know. One part of the presentation that I didn't share was Albert Murray. I read his subtitle, I read his total title, but let me refer to it again. The Omni-Americans, Some Alternatives to the Folklore of White Supremacy. The folklore of white supremacy. So by putting it in those terms, Murray didn't just say white supremacy. He called it what it actually is, a folk belief, kind of a, you know, this is not something, this is before like the age of science and reason. It's like a, you know, almost a tribalistic folk belief of superiority or supremacy. And it was a corollary to it. So he called it the fake lore of Black pathology. So you had the folklore of white supremacy that said that these people are superior or supreme. But the fake lore of Black pathology was everything about these other people is pathological. His work was against both of those. So I think one way is calling it out for what it is. It's a lie, it's folklore. So when I say it, I usually say the folklore of white supremacy, and that's how I do it, at least.
Yeah, I'll offer that I think there are a couple of things that are tricky about the use of that term. And at the same time, I understand why people use it. I tend to speak about social identity supremacy as something that can happen amongst humans, right? So right now in this country, you know, the prevailing sort of group are white racialized people, you know, generally speaking. Does that mean they're supreme? No, and that's sort of a problem with the term. If we were to be technically clear about it, it would be white supremacism, right? It's a doctrine. So that's the folklore part, you know, that Greg is talking about. And there are some people who actually believe that. So it's not a lie to say that there are white supremacists out there, right? People who believe that about themselves and act accordingly. It is confusing to say white and supreme, you know, because it suggests, well, first of all, are there really white people out there? So we're losing the whole racialization piece, and are they supreme? So if I had advice to give, you know, folks have to synthesize things in their own way, it would be to recognize that social identity supremacy, you know, is something we're always vulnerable to, right? But it is a supremacist, it's an ism, it's a doctrine, and we must lean against the idea that some people are essentially better or worse than others.
I want to refer to Reverend Dr. Starlet Thomas. Maybe she was getting ready to say it because I listened to you and you said white body supremacy, referring to the work of Dr. Resmaa Menakem, who is in the earlier draft of my piece that I had to cut, but will be hopefully in the published draft because it's there. Because so there's different ways of describing it. You know, I like that. It's, you know, he's talking about embodiment, the body, you know, and whose body is considered. So I like that variation. So I wanted to refer to you with that because, you know, you had, I probably stole your thunder. You getting ready?
No,
you getting ready
I
to
have
say
another.
it?
No, I have another one. That's
good.
But no, but I do also cite Menakem in my work, the published version that we'll have together. So I'm glad to know that we're pairing in that way. But I wanted to lift up another framework of white supremacy as systemic narcissism. So let me just read a piece, just a bit, and there's some work on it. And this particular writer says, this is how narcissism works. The narcissist, the white supremacist, possesses all power and stops at nothing to keep it. It truly believes it's more deserving than everyone else. It gives itself the best and the most, and then boasts of its inevitable success. Violence, manipulation, and lies are common tactics to avoid and distract from the injustice. When the scapegoats voice their difficulties, the narcissist points to the golden child as proof that the scapegoats haven't worked hard enough, sound familiar, and are therefore unworthy. They do this repeatedly over time. It's called gaslighting. It can seep into the scapegoat's psyche, resulting in poor self-esteem and redirect the scapegoat's anger towards their own people. I'm gonna leave it there.
There was a moment, I guess there have been moments where, folks in the mental health field were sort of speculating about like what's going on in this person's brain. And then there were some folks who were saying, well, we shouldn't do that. That's actually irresponsible. If I'm a therapist, I shouldn't do that at a distance. And I'm sort of like of two minds about that. Again, if there's something to observe about what's happening out in the world, then I think it's okay to make an observation. And I do think that narcissistic personality disorder, as it's called technically, is an apt frame, to capture and understand much of the behavior that we see, coming out of Washington today. And, it's not just one person, obviously. I think there are a lot of people who sort of lean that way, and we're sort of living the impact of that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and this is directed to you, Dr. Hoyt, from Jen Frederick. In the paradigm of DEI for all versus DEI for us, how might we understand identity-based affinity groups function?
Great question. Especially since we're running out of time, I'll try to be quick, and I want to leave space for other folks who want to jump in and answer this one too. What I try to say in the book and what I try to say in general to folks is this is not a yes or no for me, right? It's not an always never. It's an under what circumstances, right? When might it be useful for, a group of folks to be a little bit away from other folks, and talk about something that's happening for them? Cancer survivors, right? People recovering from alcoholism, right? Folks who just went through some sort of trauma, and folks who, by dint of the way they are identified in the world, are facing circumstances that are kind of unique to them, right? Because of the way they are identified by sex or gender or sexual orientation. If it might be useful for them to now and then step away and be away from the gaze of those people who don't understand as well and might be oppressive, I'm not sure there's anything wrong with that. Other end of the spectrum, we work with elementary school kids. They are as young as 4 years old, and we put them in racial identity groups just automatically. That I'm not sure we need to do, right? So it's not a question of always, never, like that's bad or that's good. It's under what circumstances might this be useful? And I think as long as we're thoughtful about that, we might not satisfy everybody who has a rigid position on it, but at least we can say we were thoughtful about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoyt, and to all of our panelists. This was such an enriching discussion, which is the trend of the day.